Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Danéel van Eck, the Strategy Director for EPIC ERP. And this is Professor Albert Wocke, who I'll introduce in more detail shortly. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to one of a series of Value Create events where we address topical issues that affect our customers' businesses. Today's event is called Stuck in the Middle, and it's about service delivery protests. Since August 2020, there have been 5 service delivery protests per day on average. The impact of these protests has been to shut down businesses, disrupt supply chains, and disrupt access to markets. These service delivery protests are no fault of yours and are generally outside of your control, hence the Stuck in the Middle title. Terrifyingly, often the physical damage that can be caused to your property and others' property by these protests will not be covered by standard insurance. Most of these protests are unpredictable, and therefore it is essential to take them into account in your business planning. Today's talk will be given by Albert Wocke, who I introduced just now. He's a professor at the Gordon Institute of Business Science of the University of Pretoria. Albert has been on the GIBS faculty since 2000, where he joined after a career as a trade union official. He was executive director of faculty from 2009 until 2013. He's a former trade unionist academic, and he's interested in international HR and business in emerging markets, with particular interest in Africa. His work has been published in the International Journal of Human Resource Management, the Journal of International Management, and the International Business Review, and he consults widely to multinationals in Africa. He has produced several case studies that are taught internationally on several continents, and is currently working on institutions and their impact on firms in Africa. His academic qualifications include a BA Honours, Masters in Political Science, MA, an MBA, and a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. We'll move on to the presentation now. If you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the chat, and we'll deal with them either during the presentation or at the end in the Q&A session. I'll now hand over to Professor Wocke for the presentation.
Hi, Danéel. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Absolute pleasure for me to be here, and I'm looking forward to a lot of questions from you. I'm looking forward to helping, guiding, just give some insights to this very, very tough situation, this tough topic that we're dealing with. So before I get into it, let me just give some background on my interest in this space. So about 5 years ago, I started picking up that service delivery protests and community protests were becoming a bigger and bigger issue that one needs to take notice of. I was doing some work with a mining company, and we were talking about labor issues in particular, and it came out that community issues were just as important, if not more so. This was an international mining company that was losing as much as 45 million rand per day with community issues. And it was clear in the session that I was having with him that they weren't actually tracking that. This was in June of that year, and I was with the exco of that mine, and I asked them, so how many days have your operations been shut down because of community protest? And there was a big debate whether it was 9 days or 12 days. And 1 day at 45 million rand is quite substantial. But this wasn't even a specific line item. It was just, this is what it is, doing business in South Africa. And then I went to an international conference, and I engaged with other academics on what are the issues that were coming up. And we discovered that service delivery protests and violent protests that shut down your business with a community or driven by the community have become a big issue, particularly in the last decade or so. And examples were given to us of these events in Chile, in Peru, Indonesia. We even heard a case in Jordan where a community had shut down the building of a nuclear power station by a Russian company of all things. The community had invaded the control room of this nuclear power station that they were building and shut it down because they were demanding reaction. They were demanding services from their government. They felt they weren't being heard. Now, you as a business person, there's not much you can do about it. You are pretty much stuck in the middle. So that's the background here. Then I started collecting data. Initially, it was in single cases on what's happening, and there were I picked up big important stories. For instance, a construction company that had a contract to build about 20 kilometers of road to a mine. And the plan was to build this road, and this road would go past several communities. And you would build the first few miles, and you'd hire workers from community A to build those first few miles. Then the next few miles that go past another village, you'd get everybody from community B. They would come in, and then community C, and so on. So you'd be creating jobs and sharing the build and the spend across multiple communities. Now, this whole project just stopped. And the reason it stopped was they built about 7 kilometers past community A. And then when they wanted to demobilize workers from community A, guess what happened? They just said, no, we do not want to be demobilized. And so then there was a big engagement with the trade union. And so they reached an agreement with the trade union, upped the severance pay. And so then the company thought, life's all good. It's sorted. Let's move on. Unfortunately, the next day, the workers joined with the community, said, no, the union no longer represents us. And they started burning plant and equipment.
Oh, wow.
And so then the company went and brought in security, wanted to bring in the police, and they also went to go get an interdict in place. And their contractor, the company that owned that contract, stopped that too. They said, no, you cannot do that. We have an agreement with the local chief, and he doesn't want you to retrench those workers. And so now the company is sitting in a situation where they cannot go ahead. They cannot use those workers for the next few kilometers because they already have an agreement with the next community. So now we're in a situation where that road is never going to be finished. It has not finished. It is never going to be finished. And those are the type of issues. And there's a lot of these examples. You get another type of community protest where it's called a shakedown, where you have elements who hijack the community protest, and they call themselves a business forum or something similar. And they arrive in 1 or 2 taxis, sometimes in a small bus, and they arrive at your gate and they say, we believe you have to spend money in our community. And essentially it's a shakedown that happens. And then they threaten you. And if you do concede, then another group pops up the next day or the next week and says, no, we also want part of this.
Because they know you'll go for it.
Yeah, so one large retail company built a distribution center in KZN, and life was going along well according to plan until they put their sign up and they were about to open. And then they got visited by business forums or communities forums that said, we want you to spend here. a mine has started opening, operating, and they got visited by the local taxi association, who said that, sorry, I'm not moving forward like that, who said that they needed to be in on the action. There's a new taxi route that is required now, and they need a subsidy for the taxi route. So this is essentially a shakedown and how you need to operate and deal with these issues.
How to manage that, yeah.
In this environment. Okay, so now the problem you've got is with service delivery protests, you are pretty much stuck in the middle. Why are you stuck in the middle? You're stuck in the middle because very often these service delivery protests are aimed at local government. They're aimed at lack of service delivery. They're aimed at crime. They're aimed at lack of water, electricity. And there's nothing that you, as a business person in that, on the fringes of the community, can do. You are stuck in the middle.
And you're not responsible for it.
Yeah, the municipalities failed. What are you going to do? So, for example, there's one mining company I'm working with in Limpopo. In 2019, they spent 200 million rand on community issues, on their social labor plan. And the stoppages outside the gates just continued. They just kept climbing. It had absolutely no impact.
200 million.
You'd think 200 million, you can buy a bit of peace and quiet, but not at all. So this is the big issue. So let's take a look at what SDPs actually look like. What's been happening? So SDP, service delivery protests. So since 2013, there were about 2.5 protests recorded per day. And that's been building, and it was stable. But then we had COVID, and with the first lockdown, it came down again. But then in July, for some other reason, the protests just spiked, and there were more than 3 a day. Most of these protests are in Gauteng, Western Cape, and KZN, but Gauteng is the guts of it. Yeah, absolutely. And then, so since August, it's just been climbing. And because we've got local government elections in October, it was announced in October this year, you can expect service delivery protests to increase quite dramatically until at least the local government elections. So what these numbers should really get your attention. If you haven't been affected, your customers, your suppliers absolutely have. Your labor has, absolutely. So look at that, 909 recorded service delivery protests from the 1st of August 2020 to the 31st of January 2021. That is 5 per day. And by the way, those are recorded by the police.
So there might be more that are not
There
recorded.
are way more than that. Yeah. So those are ones that the police actually attended to. Look at how many people have been arrested for public violence during the same period.
And those are, only the ones that were arrested. Doesn't mean
absolutely,
that there aren't more that are...
Absolutely. And most of the time you don't arrest.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is 62% of these were peaceful. That doesn't mean there was not destruction of property. Absolutely, it always accompanied by destruction of property and intimidation.
And what kind of destruction of property?
At the moment, what we're seeing is that there's destruction of infrastructure. So you're getting examples where roads are being dug up just to prevent vehicles.
So your customers can't get to you. You can't make deliveries. You can't go and can't get deliveries from suppliers.
Absolutely. And of course, your staff are getting intimidated, and you'll see that they're not able to get to work. And yeah, so it's becoming more frequent. And what do you do? What do you do? So let's move on to what traditionally, if you go to one of the larger consulting firms, they will tell you you need a social license to operate. Now, this is what you traditionally were were trying to do around this. And it's a big issue. If your firm, if your company is very, very visible in a community, and by the way, these communities are normally informal settlements or semi-formal settlements on the outskirts of the city. Think Kaya Sands, think Honeydew, those kind of areas, think the East Rand. Simon, it's very difficult to know how many people are at a protest. They vary in size. I think the big issue there is the disruption and the disruptive effect. Sometimes it's smaller, but then in a place like Attridgeville, it just expands.
So it could be what, thousands of people?
Generally, it's tens, and then it becomes hundreds.
Okay.
But it's the disruption that's the big issue. Right. What we have seen, for instance, now is when an informal settlement, when you have a land invasion next to a formal community, then it becomes big, and then it blows up. And
by definition, from a land invasion, they won't have access to services. So
yeah, so the situation you've got, what is that there's new migration patterns in South Africa. So people are moving from rural areas where there are no jobs, they're moving to the cities, and they're setting up informal dwellings. If those dwellings have been in place for a month, then they're expected to have services.
Yeah.
And now the people who've moved into those dwellings, they come to Johannesburg, they come to the cities with the hope that they'll find jobs, that they'll be able to...
And be close to the work as well.
Yeah, and that they can support themselves.
Yes.
But when they don't, and when they can't support themselves, then they have to go back to where they came from, because otherwise they starve. So you could imagine the pressure that those people are experiencing, and they expect water, they expect services, and that's what's below it. And now we've seen the absolute failure of most of the local governments and the extensive corruption to be able to get access to those resources.
So these people could have moved to be close to perceived work, or there might be a large player right there that they want to get work with or are getting work from, but then they don't get services, and then you might have your company sitting right nearby, and then you get affected by this, even though you had nothing to do with it.
Absolutely. So that is very much the case. If you look on the East Rand, where you look at Mpumalanga, Highveld, Delmos, that kind of area, you're seeing that absolutely. Where look at the whole Witbank, Middelburg, all of those areas where people have just flocked in there, looking for a better life, looking for jobs, looking for just water, electricity,
basic things, yeah.
And they're not getting it. Okay, so traditionally, you would be looking at a social license where your firm's highly visible and your community is more coherent. So there's not too much flex around it. So this would work in Limpopo and places like that. This works in Zimbabwe, for instance, where you've got communities and it's more rural. And that's where you look for a social license, what we call a social license. So the community accepts and supports you doing business there around them.
Right. And that's when you have the definition that you have a social license to operate. Yeah.
So I don't know why this is not, let's move to the next slide.
So as opposed to a real license, just to come back to that, it's a perceived
Yes, exactly right. So the community is giving you permission to operate.
Right.
So you're a big employer, and they see their interests as your interests.
Aligned. Okay.
So that's a social license.
Right.
So we talk about levels of social license. Level one is the community is withdrawn or withholding the license to operate. So they are sabotaging your vehicles, they're sabotaging your premises. They do not want you there. If you're a big polluter, you're doing something that they perceive as damaging, or you're making money out of their community and you're not bringing anything back.
Right.
Think about a company like an MTN sitting in the southern part of Nigeria. There you had to have the local chief, or even the local warlord, if you want, has to give you a social license you can operate. So you have to give a few free cell phones and engage with them before you can even operate your tower without your tower being destroyed. So, and then, so that's level 2. You get to level 2, you get an acceptance, a tentative allowing of operations, and it's subject to community concerns. Level 3 is approval when the community supports the operations of your firm and may even be pleased with these operations. Now, ideally, that is where you want to be, but the problem you've got is these communities are so large, the problems are so large, you don't employ tens of thousands of people. The old days of mining where you employ 10,000 people are long gone. So that becomes a little bit more difficult. There, that would more likely be government-initiated community employment schemes and the like. And then psychological identification, where the community is confident that the firm will act in its best interest.
Can you think of any examples of that?
This happens where you've got a mining company that's actually got it right. So, or managed to get got it right, I mean, the social license right. So think about the Royal Bafokeng, where the community absolutely believes and experience that the mine and the partners in mining are acting in their interest. Absolutely, absolutely. Simon, most people you're too busy doing business to think about a social license. A social license is it's quite a complicated term. And to get your social license is going to require you to engage. So how many business people are actually going out and engaging in the communities to understand what the community wants and get a feel for it?
So that delve into stakeholder management.
Absolutely, it does delve into stakeholder management. So one of the ways you can do it and deal with this is you need to form associations, business associations in your area, so Kaya Sands Business Association, and you would employ people whose role it is to engage with the community. Right. If you're trying to manage your social license and evolve your relationship.
And keep it even if you have one, because just because you have one today doesn't mean that you're going to have it tomorrow.
Absolutely. With migration, these communities are changing. The nature of these communities are changing all the time. And who was a leader last year is now an opposition. Or they get undermined, and especially when you've got local government elections coming up. So now we're going to see more and more alliances, loose alliances created around local government and into the future. There's a fragmentation.
And now you were talking about social license to operate and how, so, I mean, this would typically be a company that is having a large impact on the community, or at least is highly visible, like you said.
Yes.
But the impact could be felt, like we said, by other smaller companies that aren't highly visible, aren't affecting the community in any way, may have been there before the large player moved in, but they're still affected by the action, which results from a lack of a social license.
Yes, absolutely, because they're upstream, so they suppliers to this, or they just get caught up in the. So think about the NUMSA, the big NUMSA strike. When was it? It was about 2-3 years ago, where NUMSA was going into the industrial areas and they were pulling workers out. And whether your workers were NUMSA or not, they were out. There was not much you were going to be doing. There's talk about another bus strike coming up. You're going to be affected. You're going to be absolutely affected. And it's going to have a community side to it. The burning of the trucks on the N3, those fall into these. So Joe, who measures the quantity and severity? The police do. And so you get your official police stats, and then you've got the two big companies that look at this data, or at least try to work through this data, is the Institute of Security Studies and Municipal IQ. But those are the big players, but there's a lot that just doesn't get noticed. I'm doing some work with one of the large mining groups, and they've got a lot of mines all over the show. And what's interesting is they're not even tracking it. So the quality of data they've got is varying all over the show. People haven't actually got to grips with this. So this is still quite a new issue. I want to move on. I will make these slides available, absolutely. I'm not sure why.
There we go. I think
Okay, let's move. Keep going. I'll give this as background. So let's take a look at our service delivery protests. So since 2004, these have increased. We had never heard of service delivery protests prior to 2004. Now they're in an institution. What that means is an institution means it is a normal way of doing business. It is something you will expect. If you're doing business in this country, you will have service delivery protests.
Right.
So it's an institution.
Why 2004? What was the trigger?
I don't actually know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, cool.
We don't really know. Nobody's actually.
It must have been a boiling point, a culmination somehow.
Yeah,
of
because
dissatisfaction or
2003 was where this was first noticed, and then 2004 it was. Now this, if you operate in South Africa or an environment similar to this, this is ops normal. This is you will be affected by this.
And you say environments similar to this. So what are some other examples where
emerging
this is?
Markets like Peru? You're picking Anglo-Americans picking it up in Chile, as a for instance. You've got this in Zambia. So yeah, it's an institution. This is a global institution. Most of the time, it's initiated by community members due to dissatisfaction with service delivery. 13% of the reported cases are labor issues. And by labor issues, it's a lot broader than just you've got some angry workers. It could be the workers next door. It could be a national strike.
So what would an example be there of like the workers next door? How would that work?
That's NUMSA.
Okay.
So NUMSA shutting down the whole area and keeping everybody out of work.
Okay, so you're collateral damage even though you got nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
Terrifying.
So you've got a situation at the moment. So if we want to move to labor just briefly, in South Africa, labor density is actually, or union density is actually quite low. So fewer than 30% of formally employed workers are unionized. And that number hasn't changed in the last 30 odd years. But on the other hand, you've got more than 200 registered trade unions chasing that market, and that small market.
So the number of trade unions has grown, but not the number of people in trade unions.
Exactly.
So it's just diluted.
So the density hasn't changed.
Okay.
Yeah. And so now so in was it 2011, 2013, around about there, NUMSA decided that they were going to recruit outside of their industry. And now they're recruiting bus drivers, they're recruiting in the mines and so on. And that triggered a massive rivalry amongst unions and a breakaway federation. And so you've got more and more of this at play, union rivalry at play. And
so they were playing nicely, saying, okay, this is our industry that we're sticking to.
Yeah.
And then they decided, no, we need to expand.
Yeah.
And now the other guys get upset because, okay, now you're encroaching on our thing.
Yeah. And to recruit, you've got to demonstrate that you're bringing results.
Right. Ability to negotiate.
Yeah. And that they're taking you seriously. And when violence is associated with your activities, you get attention.
Terrifying.
Okay, so that's also a trend that's played out. The NEDLAC and the CCMA did take some steps in 2014 to try and reduce that, but we have to see. Okay, so what is associated with marches, demonstrations, barricades, and damage to property? Generally informal settlements. It's triggered by unemployment, crime, political promises, statements, and you're going to expect a lot more of those until October. Hijacked service delivery protests. This is where your forums, I've spoken about that. And your stakeholder management techniques like that social license technique often don't work. They make no difference. There's not much you can do. You're not going to be able to spend your way out of this.
The example, the 200 million, and they didn't get anywhere.
Yeah, if a large mining company can put 200 million into a community in Limpopo and it gets nowhere, you haven't got to open up.
And the hijacked STPs, that's where you're saying the people who are trying to shake you down take advantage of the service delivery process, protest, jump on board and say, no, well, this is going to happen more and more unless you start paying me.
Yes. And they even create their own service delivery protest.
Okay.
And that could be a smaller service delivery protest.
Okay. So other people might jump on board because they were actually upset about service delivery, but the whole thing was instigated by someone that's just looking for rent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rent seeking is what it is. So building infrastructure, it's not viable. Limited projects, your problem, if you do some of these big limited projects and you put your name to it, you're attracting a fair amount of attention. And you do not want to be seen as an ATM, a cash machine, because then you've got the 200 million problem. Okay, if we can move forward. Okay, so now how is this playing off? How is this affecting you? So we've done a fair amount of research. We've gathered a lot of data. We've surveyed companies, mainly on the East Rand, West Rand, and in the mining sector, about how they are affected by this. So these are the main effects that you're having. Access is blocked. So you've got a service delivery protest down the road from you, outside your gate. You can't make deliveries. You cannot get supplies. Worker absenteeism climbs, your workers can't come to work.
Yeah, or they're scared.
And they're scared. They're
intimidated.
Absolutely. There's no question about the intimidation. Do not underestimate the amount of intimidation that happens, especially if your staff are coming from these areas. The threats by the local community, that's on the firm or its leadership, that's the hijacked SDP. And you find it arson and assault of staff. What's interesting is some of the big mining companies, they've got people who are employed to engage with the community and the intimidation that happens to them at different times.
So Table Mountain wasn't providing the right services. Huh?
It would appear that way. And this is a wry laugh. This isn't amusing. It's a tough environment. And you're going to have issues with disrupted operations, insurance, and lost customers. Okay, so let's move on. So what happened in the coal mines? There you've got smaller coal mines on the East Rand. Their experience was communities are fragmented. There's a lot of disruptions caused by their mining operations. They feel that there's pollution. And they want to see spend. They want to see spend in their community. The closer you are to the mine, the more instability you've got. And forums, a fragmentation of forums. The problem the mines are having is they have formal engagement structures. So they have community engagement structures where they invite people to, or these forum members to sit on another forum, if you wish, and there they would negotiate and consult about what they're going to spend money on. Now, the problem with that is these things keep popping up. And if they don't have sufficient mandate or support, you're just setting yourself up for a headache, and you're going to get no return on investment. Okay, so let's move. What kind of spending do they expect? Stian, the main thing that they're looking for is actually jobs. They're actually looking for jobs. That's the main spend. But beyond that, they're looking for service delivery. So,
and like you said, I mean, it might not be practical to provide 10,000 jobs in a particular area.
You can't. So the hijacked SDPs, you're going to see they're going to say, I want you to see me as your community partner, your BE partner, or whatever. And that's the way they approach you. Okay, so engagement activities work when the community is united. Older businesses viewed with suspicion. This is the coal mines. If they don't have community connections, you need to have community connections. I think let's move forward to let's look at the type of initiatives that this is what the coal mines are saying helps a little bit for that. And that is giving regular feedback on social labor plans, because the mines, in terms of their license, have to have a social labor plan. They have to show the kind of spend that they...
So that's communication.
They need regular feedback on that. The problem that many of the mines have is they do this every 3 years. They put the SLP together every 3 years, and then they don't finish it, they don't deliver it, and so on. One of the issues, for instance, with Marikana and Lonmin back in the day, you remember the Marikana issue? There was a promise of building accommodation, and that accommodation never materialized. Not entirely Lonmin's fault, but there were complications. So, for instance, the first batch of housing they built, people didn't want to move in there. They wanted to be paid to move in there. People wanted to rent out their accommodation assigned to them and things like that. So it became very, very complicated. The incubation of SMEs, small, medium enterprises, by the mines and the larger companies, they're trying that. But your problem with that is you build a dependency relationship. So your enterprise must try, you wanted to hit a conversion, in other words, where it's not dependent on you anymore, that it can run and operate by itself. That takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. Okay, let's move to what's happening to more your clients.
What can
So
they do
your
to manage
clients,
this?
the issues you're finding are, it's difficult to be proactive due to the unpredictability. You can't predict how many of these things are going to hit you this year or next year. You can't. So how are you proactive? How do you tell your staff, come stay at work? You just don't know. Lobbying local government is one of the ways of doing it, but there you've got to be very, very careful, because if you lobby the local government in the wrong way, they can also start treating you like an ATM.
Right.
Okay. So, but you do need to, because it's local government's failure that's creating this problem for you. So I would suggest you create larger associations that they lobby government.
Right, okay.
And then at least you've got a layer between you.
Yes, insulated.
And open and supportive business culture and values. What's very important is to understand your staff don't want to do this, and your staff are affected by it. And your staff know what's happening. So that's your early warning system. as well as your way of managing it.
Okay.
And so flexi time and working in, companies have found that when there is a service delivery protest in their area, they talk to their staff, great, we'll work in over the weekend, or we start work once, because these STPs, normally they start very early in the morning. So great, our workday starts at 10 o'clock.
Okay.
And we run till
Would that apply to other
afterwards.
labor action as well?
It depends.
Okay, what kind?
Depends
Yeah, right.
on the type. What's interesting is the hijacked STPs, these forums that hijack you. Yeah, what has worked is a hard response. So legal and civil action, just going to the effort of getting papers served on the individuals. They melt away.
Okay.
This is what we've been finding. WhatsApp groups, so set up WhatsApp groups with all your employees and with the local firms around you, because sometimes their intelligence is better than yours.
Okay, that's clear.
And so talk about what's happening. WhatsApp groups are very, very quick. Rapid communication with suppliers and customers. What was interesting in our research was that many suppliers and customers are experiencing the same thing. So they are sympathetic to this. But their problem is they need to know, they need to plan. So don't hold it from them and then
affect their logistics.
Yeah.
Right.
Some of your suppliers are small and you want to give them risk mitigation plans. So you engage with them in training rather than penalties. Build strong relationships with local authorities, ward councillors and the police.
So you get the help when you need it.
Yeah. And then inventory stock and using multiple suppliers, and then trade with local community liaison officers who live in the community. They're very useful to help with hijacked STPs. And here's a crazy one. Some companies were attaching tow bars to staff cars to attach a trailer to assist with deliveries for those staff
because the delivery vehicles can't get up.
Yes, okay. So
So
office workers go do deliveries on their way. Okay, so we're running out of time. So this slide is essentially giving you your options on how to manage the risk. So let's start at the right top, adapt. I've given you some examples of adapting. The ones that I haven't spoke about are joint ventures or alliances, multiple suppliers, move upstream, so own your suppliers, or downstream, buy into your customers. Diversify, this we're seeing more and more of. People are just saying, let's just import. China can produce. Or you operate in different communities, because not all your communities are hit by
at the same time.
So just spread your risk. Or some companies can speculate and avoid risk. So you are stable and you can become a supplier. Stian, how would the company...
Lorenz.
Sorry? Lorenz, will the continued of non-delivery of services result in local government change? Lorenz, in some places, yes. In some places, yes. But most places, it's difficult to tell. So if I have to make a call at the moment, I would say in many of the most disrupted, smaller municipalities, it's going to be the same thing, where you're going to have these, they're going to stumble along and they're going to go under management at some stage, or administration at some stage. Unfortunately, the skill sets in those local governments are not great. The big metros, that's a different game altogether. That's a totally different game altogether. And you tell me, has the EFF got their act together? Has the DA got their act together? Has Herman Mashaba got their act together? Now, I'm a political scientist originally by training. Pretty much the ANC is going to battle to stem the loss of support. Now, how that's going to play out is anybody's question. It's going to, but there's essentially only two ways it can play out. The other parties attract attention, or voters just don't go to the polls. So that's how it plays out. It's very difficult once you're in a trend of losing support to turn it around. You look at countries like India and the like, but that's a whole different conversation. Okay, how would a company find out which communities are in an area that they want to move into? Your quickest answer there is going to be to speak to other companies who are already there. So that's who I would talk to. I would also go onto the SAP's official crime stats base and take a look at what are the unrest issues there. Go to the Institute of Security Studies. You can also see they've got a map with hot spots, and you can zoom in and you can pick up the issues there. Municipal IQ also tracks it, but municipal IQ, the conclusions they draw aren't always right, but they've got the data. I hope that helps.
Well, were there any of these that you still wanted to address on the, I think at the bottom, the hedging?
The hedging, that's pretty much
just
a mug's game. You're not going to be able to.
It's not going to work well. Yeah, it's going to be expensive if you can get it.
It's going to be expensive.
Great. We are a little bit over time, but quickly, are there any other questions? Yes,
sure. Why so much destruction and violence? It's the community's experience that is what gets the attention of the politicians. If there wasn't destruction, if it was a peaceful protest, nobody would do much. Joe, yes, I'm in the middle of looking at this internationally. I'm working with a multinational that is very concerned about particularly this. You've got, surprisingly, a big issue in Canada with the First Nations. So it's even places like Canada, you've got this. You're even seeing it in parts of Europe where people are blowing up. Just ask Amazon and Germany. But the level of violence and destruction is not quite the same as what we see here.
Okay, very interesting. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, we'll leave it there because of time. Thank you very much, Professor Wocke, for those insights.
Thanks, that was
into
fun.
the service delivery process and then how we can navigate these concerns as well. Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, thanks everyone who joined us today. We hope you found the content useful and we hope you'll join us for further events in this Value Create series. We will be providing a recording of today's session online in a few weeks for anyone who couldn't make the session today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks, Albert.
Thank you very much.